Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a story that sounds like it's straight out of a movie, but it's anything but fiction. Imagine a scam so large that it could change the way we think about trust, money, and the people we put our faith in. A scam that pulled the wool over the eyes of some of the wealthiest and most powerful individuals in the world, all while hiding behind the glitziest of facades. Welcome to the $1 billion scam. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It all started with what seemed like an irresistible offer. On the surface, the company appeared legitimate. So legitimate, in fact, that many of its early investors were famous celebrities, high-end business moguls, and even former politicians. This was the kind of business venture you'd hear about at swanky cocktail parties, where the wine was expensive and the promises were even more so. At first glance, everything was pristine. A sleek, glossy website, luxury offices in the heart of the city, high-end marketing campaigns designed to make you think of it as the next big thing. The mastermind behind it all, a smooth-talking, impeccably dressed man who seemed to ooze charisma from every pore. He was the kind of person who could sell sand to a desert, and people were buying it, hook, line, and sinker. Investors believed in him. They trusted him. And what they didn't know was that they were on the brink of being taken for a ride that would ultimately cost them billions. This wasn't just any scam. It was an artfully designed operation, one that took months of meticulous planning and execution to pull off. And the worst part? It wasn't just a few $1 million here and there. It was $1 billion, disappearing before anyone could blink. But let's start with the mastermind. This man, this charming and persuasive figure, was not some obscure individual. He was a man of influence, the kind who could walk into any room and instantly gain the trust of the most discerning investors. With the look of a man who had it all figured out, he projected confidence, sophistication, and success. His company had everything a modern investor could dream of: high returns, cutting-edge technology, and a promise of future growth that seemed too good to be true. But as you might suspect, there were cracks hiding behind this sparkling veneer. As we unravel this tale, keep an eye on how the scam slowly starts to take shape. It's easy to be skeptical now, sitting in the comfort of your own home. But back then, no one had any reason to believe they were walking into a trap. The hardest part? The scam's true nature wasn't revealed until those who had trusted it had already invested their life savings. Now that you have a sense of how it all began, let's take a closer look at the mastermind behind this billion-dollar scam. The man at the center of it all wasn't just any ordinary scam artist. He was a man who had crafted a persona so convincing that even the most experienced investors couldn't see through it. His name, although not immediately familiar, would soon become infamous as his carefully curated life started to unravel piece by piece. At first, he didn't look like a villain. In fact, when he first entered the room, he had that rare mix of charm and intelligence that made you trust him almost instantly. He spoke in a calm, confident tone, with just enough mystery to make you believe he had insider knowledge of a world most people would never see. This wasn't someone who ran around making wild promises. No, this man made his offers sound like simple, logical steps toward success. Every word he said was wrapped in carefully constructed layers of confidence and persuasion. He wasn't boasting. He was laying down the foundation for something larger, a future everyone could believe in. He wasn't flashy, but there was something magnetic about him. He dressed well, sure, but it wasn't the kind of ostentatious style that screamed, "I'm rich." Instead, he wore sharp suits that exuded quiet luxury. His hair was perfectly styled, and his watch, although clearly expensive, didn't shout about its brand. No, this man wore subtle power like a second skin. It was the kind of power that made you think, this guy knows something I don't. But the charm didn't stop there. His company's pitch was something everyone wanted to hear. Be part of the future. Get in early. You won't regret it. No big promises, no flashy language, just clean, crisp, calm persuasion. He spoke in the language of investors. Numbers, growth charts, projections of massive returns. On paper, it all made sense. He was a visionary, leading his company with the strategic mind of someone who'd been in the business for decades. But here's the thing. In reality, the numbers didn't add up. There were no real investments happening. No actual projects being built. Nothing was as it seemed. The problem was, no one had thought to dig deeper until it was too late. What made him especially effective was his ability to blend in seamlessly with the world of high society. He didn't run with the traditional scam artist crowd. No, he was a socialite in his own right, rubbing elbows with those who had billions at their disposal. He was invited to elite parties, hosted gala events, and appeared at conferences, all the while continuing to sell his grand vision. And of course, the investors ate it up. What's interesting is that the victims didn't just consist of naive, small-time investors. In fact, the scam's reach extended far beyond the average person looking to make a quick buck. This man had convinced some of the most prominent players in the financial world to trust him. Lawyers, bankers, hedge fund managers, and even some celebrities. People who prided themselves on knowing the ins and outs of successful investments were lining up to hand over their money. They trusted him because, well, how could someone with this kind of charm and track record possibly be lying? The mastermind's connections and his impeccable social skills made him nearly untouchable. He was everywhere, and yet nowhere at the same time. His name was whispered in rooms filled with wealth and influence, and soon it wasn't just small-time investors getting involved. It was the very people who controlled the world's financial systems. What's truly fascinating, however, is how the mastermind used his network to insulate himself. Every move he made was calculated to ensure that his operations stayed hidden. On paper, his company appeared legitimate, even thriving. He created fake investments and fabricated reports, all designed to make it look like the company was doing better than it actually was. But it was all smoke and mirrors, elaborate illusions meant to distract and manipulate. And for a while it worked. But cracks began to show. Slowly at first, like small whispers on the wind. There were reports of discrepancies in financial statements, a few warning signs that investors began to question. But the mastermind was always there, with an answer, a new investment to present, or a reassured smile. Everything's fine. Nothing to worry about. What makes this story even more fascinating is how, despite these warning signs, people kept investing. They had already poured so much money into the scheme that it felt too late to back out. It's like a game of poker. You've already put in so much that you can't walk away from the table without losing. The scam wasn't just about stealing money. It was about creating a system where the only way out was to keep betting, keep believing. And for so long, everyone did. At this point, you might be wondering how the scam managed to remain unnoticed for so long. The answer lies in how the mastermind presented his success. It wasn't flashy, but it was constant, reliable, and above all, convincing. He had a reputation for being a steady hand, someone who could weather any storm. It wasn't until much later, when the magnitude of the fraud began to unfold, that the truth came to light. And by then, it was too late for many. As the scam continued to grow, so did the mastermind's influence. The world that he had built for himself wasn't just one of wealth. It was a world of power, connections, and perfect illusions. He was a master manipulator, and his ability to create a luxurious front for his operation was key to keeping the fraud going for so long. He didn't just offer high returns, he offered the dream of a life filled with opulence, adventure, and success. Everything about his company screamed luxury. The offices were located in high-rise buildings with sweeping views of the city, all glass and steel, gleaming and modern. The lobby was decorated with rare art pieces, some of which were worth millions. Investors who entered these spaces were greeted with smiles, handshakes, and assurances that they were part of something big, something world-changing. There were even events held at exclusive venues, where high-profile speakers, expensive champagne, and endless promises filled the air. The mastermind understood that people don't just invest their money, they invest their hopes and dreams. And he knew how to tap into that. The company didn't just seem successful, it seemed unstoppable. It was like walking into a movie set for the rich and famous, and who wouldn't want to be a part of that? But beneath the gleaming exterior, there was nothing. No product, no real investment, just the skillful use of smoke and mirrors. He wasn't building anything of substance. He was just using new investors' money to pay off the older ones, keeping the illusion alive with each new dollar that flowed in. It was classic Ponzi scheme behavior, yet it was wrapped in a package so pristine and alluring that no one wanted to look too closely. The reality of what was really going on was hidden behind lavish marketing campaigns, flashy ads, and the illusion of trustworthiness. This facade was reinforced by the people he surrounded himself with, individuals who were either duped or complicit in the scam. They wore expensive suits, gave polished presentations, and spoke the language of success. Their job was to make the entire operation look legitimate. After all, who would question a company that had industry professionals in their corner? It's almost too easy to imagine this sort of world, a glossy surface, a high glamour, high-stakes illusion. But here's the kicker, it worked. For years, people bought into it. Investors from all walks of life, looking for a way to grow their wealth quickly, lined up to hand over their money, convinced that they were part of something big, something exclusive. It wasn't just the individuals with a small amount of savings. No, some of the largest investors in the world were taken in. Hedge funds, investment firms, even a few celebrity names, people who should have known better. These were individuals who had made millions in the financial world, but they too fell victim to the illusion of wealth, power, and success that the mastermind had created. The mastermind was able to leverage the success of his operation to expand even further, investing in multiple luxury real estate properties and high-profile events. Everything about his life screamed success, and that, in turn, drew in even more victims. The more he accumulated, the more people wanted a piece of the action. It was a snowball effect. The more money that came in, the more the scam grew. As it grew, so did his personal wealth. The mastermind was living a lifestyle that was the envy of many. Expensive cars, private jets, exclusive vacation homes in exotic locations, dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants. His public persona was one of ultimate success, and people, investors, couldn't resist. They saw the lavish displays of wealth and assumed that they, too, could share in that same success. What they didn't realize was that this opulent lifestyle was built on nothing but lies and manipulation. But like all elaborate lies, the truth began to creep in. Behind the scenes, cracks were beginning to show. It was impossible to maintain such a large-scale operation without anything going wrong. The mastermind was spreading himself thin, trying to juggle the expectations of thousands of investors. He was using new money to cover up the gaps, but the cracks were beginning to widen. By now, investors were starting to notice the discrepancies in their accounts. Some had been promised returns that weren't materializing. Others couldn't get in touch with their investment managers or were receiving vague, reassuring responses that didn't add up. The mastermind and his team were masters at controlling the narrative. They reassured investors by holding meetings, showing them charts and projections, and sending out glossy emails promising everything was fine. But in reality, the company was hemorrhaging money. The extravagant lifestyle was no longer sustainable. At this point, it was a race to keep the illusion alive for as long as possible. What was even more alarming was that the mastermind began to get sloppy. He had been able to keep the operation hidden for so long because of his charm and the trust he built. But now, the cracks in the facade were spreading quickly. Some of the company's backers, those who had been in the industry long enough to know when something wasn't right, began asking questions. The fraudulent behavior was harder to mask. The lies were beginning to stack up, and the cracks in the operation were starting to show. It was only a matter of time before the walls came crashing down. The truth couldn't be hidden forever. And when it did come out, when it became clear to everyone just how much money had been stolen, how many people had been deceived, the entire financial world would be rocked. The cracks in the scheme began to deepen, and as the media slowly started catching wind of the inconsistencies, the pressure mounted on the mastermind. He had managed to pull off the scam for so long, expertly manipulating everyone from low-level investors to high-profile millionaires. But even the smoothest criminals can't hide everything forever. As the first whispers of suspicion began circulating, the mastermind's response was immediate and calculated. He called in his top advisors, those he trusted to help maintain the facade of success, and together they worked tirelessly to push back against any scrutiny. Emails were sent to investors, reassuring them that everything was under control, that these were just minor bumps in the road, nothing to worry about. He continued with his meticulously crafted narrative. Everything was going according to plan. The company was merely facing a slight delay. The markets had fluctuated a bit, and the returns would be even greater once the minor issues were resolved. His reassurances were delivered with the same calm, confident smile that had won over countless investors. And for a while it worked. After all, who would doubt the person who had promised them the moon and had already delivered so much? But it wasn't just the professional investors that were growing suspicious. The personal stories began to surface. You see, some of the smaller investors were starting to feel the sting of their empty pockets. There was no way for them to reconcile the reality they were facing with the promises they had been given. They began to speak up, reaching out to each other, asking questions that they hadn't dared to ask before. Why had the company suddenly stopped responding to their calls? Why were their returns smaller than expected? Why, when they logged into their accounts, did the numbers seem off? That was the first real signal that the truth was beginning to creep to the surface. The mastermind, always one step ahead in every other part of the scheme, found himself in uncharted territory. The truth was starting to spread. The very people he had worked so hard to deceive were now beginning to band together and piece things together. But here's where it gets interesting. Rather than focusing entirely on keeping his scam alive, the mastermind turned his attention to something unexpected: controlling the narrative. He had learned, through years of operating in high society, that perception was everything. If people believed in the story, even for just a little while longer, it would give him more time to make his escape. He didn't just rely on a good story, he manufactured a new one. He took a step back from the day-to-day operations of the company and allowed his trusted team to issue a series of press releases. These releases were filled with all the right buzzwords: restructuring, temporary financial setback, and rising market volatility. They painted a picture of an industry dealing with an unfortunate but inevitable downturn. Investors were assured that the company was still profitable and that the mastermind was still very much in charge, working tirelessly to get things back on track. But more importantly, he painted himself as the hero of the story, the visionary leader who was facing adversity head-on. This was where the masterstroke came into play. He had already surrounded himself with key figures from influential backgrounds, people who could vouch for his credibility, people who were willing to stand behind him. Many of them were unwittingly caught in the web of his deceit, while others were complicit in his operation for the sheer financial gains. And these figures, these high-profile supporters, were more than just figures on paper. They were media-friendly faces who spoke in interviews, making it sound as though the company was only experiencing minor setbacks, not the massive fraud that it truly was. His trusted allies in the media were another key part of the plan. The mastermind had cultivated relationships with journalists who were not only willing to promote his story, but were also easily manipulated by his charm and promises of exclusive insider information. The media coverage was enough to keep many investors in the dark, convinced that the company was still on the verge of greatness. They didn't know what was truly happening behind closed doors, how the company was actually hemorrhaging money, how the figures were being manipulated, or how many false promises had been made. As the days passed, the mastermind continued with his media strategy, carefully guiding the narrative. On the outside, it looked like a mere blip in the financial world, a minor scandal that would eventually blow over. But in reality, the scam was coming apart at the seams. The more time passed, the more the cracks in the company's financials became glaringly obvious to anyone willing to look hard enough. What kept the mastermind hopeful was his conviction that he could still salvage his empire, even if it meant cutting ties and starting anew. But as the scrutiny intensified, things took a drastic turn. There was one thing he hadn't planned for: the growing list of whistleblowers. There were a few individuals within the company, employees who had become suspicious of the activities they were being asked to perform, who had begun leaking crucial information. They had seen the discrepancies firsthand. They had seen how the money that was supposed to be reinvested was actually being funneled elsewhere. Some of these employees, unable to live with the guilt, finally started speaking to investigators and reporters. What they shared didn't just confirm the fraud. It painted a damning picture of the mastermind's true operations. And once these whistleblowers started coming forward, there was no going back. The network of lies that the mastermind had carefully constructed began to unravel. The press, once enamored by his charm, was now doing its job. Investigations were launched, and soon the law enforcement authorities started getting involved, following the paper trail and the revelations coming from the insiders. But it was too late for the mastermind to fix things. His empire was collapsing. The trust he had spent years building crumbled overnight. His lavish lifestyle, once funded by the lies of the operation, began to fade as the reality of the fraud came to light. And as the media stormed in with their questions, he vanished. The mastermind's disappearance was as swift and calculated as his rise to power. One day, he was the charismatic leader of a thriving company, and the next, he had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a trail of questions, broken promises, and shattered lives. The media, once enamored with his story, now scrambled to make sense of what had happened. Investors, some of whom had poured everything they owned into his vision, were left to pick up the pieces of a financial nightmare. The initial shock soon gave way to disbelief. How could such an elaborate operation have lasted as long as it did? How had so many people been taken in by a story that, in hindsight, seemed too perfect to be true? The longer the mastermind remained in hiding, the more questions piled up. What was his real motive? Was this just about money, or was there something more to the scam? A larger game being played beneath the surface? As the weeks went on, the authorities closed in. Investigators worked tirelessly to trace his movements, digging through financial records and interviewing everyone who had crossed paths with him. The trail was cold, though. The mastermind had left no obvious signs of where he might have gone, no clear paper trail. It was as though he had anticipated this day, as if he had known that one day the walls would come crashing down, and when that day came, he would already be gone. For a brief time, there were rumors of sightings, whispers that he had fled to some exotic island or had slipped quietly into a small European village under a false identity. But these were just rumors, fleeting glimpses of hope from those who still wanted to believe that he hadn't gotten away with it. The truth was, no one knew for sure where he had gone. What was certain was that he had planned his escape long before anyone suspected. In the meantime, the investigation into the $1 billion scam continued. The network that had once seemed impenetrable now stood exposed, its dark underbelly laid bare for the world to see. Law enforcement worked relentlessly to track down everyone involved, but it wasn't just the mastermind they were after. They were now going after the entire structure. The people who had helped him, the ones who had turned a blind eye, and those who had knowingly played their part in keeping the scam running. Many of the people involved in the scam had already fled, just like the mastermind. Some had managed to disappear into the shadows, using their connections and resources to cover their tracks. Others, however, weren't so lucky. A few had been caught in the web of their own lies and were now facing charges of their own. The media, too, had become a double-edged sword. On one hand, the relentless coverage of the scam had helped expose the full extent of the fraud, bringing to light the stories of the victims and the ways in which they had been deceived. On the other hand, the constant scrutiny had also fueled the mastermind's escape, giving him the time and space he needed to disappear. But as the investigation continued to unfold, the cracks in the network became even more apparent. The authorities uncovered evidence that suggested the mastermind wasn't working alone. There were other figures in the background, silent partners, co-conspirators, who had helped to facilitate the scam's success. And as the web of corruption continued to unravel, more and more names started to surface. One name in particular seemed to keep coming up, the name of a well-known financier who had been involved in several high-profile investments. His association with the mastermind was not just financial, it was personal. The two had worked together on numerous occasions, and some believed that the mastermind had used his connections to gain access to some of the wealthiest and most influential figures in the world. This financier, who had once been considered one of the most respected figures in the financial world, suddenly found himself under suspicion. His ties to the mastermind were undeniable, and the authorities began questioning how much he truly knew about the scam. Was he an innocent bystander, or had he played an active role in the operation? It became clear that the scope of the scam was much larger than anyone had imagined. The mastermind had not only deceived investors on a massive scale, but he had also exploited the very system that was supposed to protect them. The financial institutions, the regulations, and the oversight mechanisms that were meant to prevent such fraud had all failed. As more names were revealed, the connections between the mastermind's operation and some of the world's most powerful people became even more apparent. It was a network of corruption and greed that stretched across borders into the highest echelons of government, finance, and business. The true scale of the fraud was shocking, and the full extent of the mastermind's deceit was slowly becoming clear. But despite the revelations, the question remained: where was the mastermind? How could someone so calculated, so precise in his planning, have disappeared without a trace? It was as though he had become a ghost, vanishing into the ether. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the authorities began to fear that they might never find him. What made the search even more difficult was the fact that the mastermind had anticipated everything. He knew that once the scam was exposed, his life would be in danger, and he would need to disappear. He had spent years building a network of trusted allies, people who could help him escape and stay hidden. And when the time came, he used those connections to vanish from the world's radar. But even in the face of such uncertainty, the authorities refused to give up. They continued to track down every lead, every trace of the mastermind's activities. His arrest became an obsession, and they knew that catching him was not just about bringing justice to the victims. It was about stopping a man who had proven he could manipulate the system and escape with a fortune. As the investigation dragged on, it became clear that this was no ordinary case. This wasn't just a financial scam. It was a story of a man who had played the game better than anyone, deceiving the world while hiding in plain sight. And in the end, it was the victims who were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, wondering how they could have been so easily deceived. The man who had once promised them everything had vanished, leaving only a trail of lies and broken dreams in his wake. As time went on, the investigation into the mastermind's disappearance intensified. It became an obsession for law enforcement, and the media continued to follow the case, eager to uncover more secrets about the scam. The longer the mastermind stayed hidden, the more pressure mounted on the authorities to solve the case. Every lead, every tip, was pursued with determination. But each time, the mastermind managed to stay one step ahead, like a ghost slipping through their fingers. In the meantime, the victims of the scam found themselves struggling to piece their lives back together. They had trusted the mastermind, believed in his promises, and now they were left with nothing but empty accounts and broken dreams. Some had lost their entire savings, while others had seen their businesses crumble. But the damage wasn't just financial, it was emotional. Trust had been shattered, not just in the mastermind, but in the system that was supposed to protect them. A few of the victims, unable to move on, formed a support group, connecting with others who had been affected. They traded stories, shared their frustrations, and sought solace in knowing they weren't alone. Some began to push for legal action, determined to hold the mastermind accountable for the devastation he had caused. But as the months wore on and the search continued without results, their hope began to fade. Meanwhile, in the hidden corners of the financial world, rumors circulated. Whispers about the mastermind's possible whereabouts, his connections, and even his next steps. Some believed he was holed up in a luxury villa, hiding under a false identity, while others speculated that he had fled to a foreign country, taking advantage of international loopholes to remain undetected. Wherever he was, it seemed clear that he was living the life of luxury he had promised to so many others, but this time at their expense. Despite these rumors, no one knew for sure where he had gone, and with each passing day, his capture seemed more and more unlikely. The authorities were left with nothing but theories and the haunting knowledge that the person responsible for one of the largest scams in history might never face justice. Then a break came. It was subtle at first, just a hint of activity, a small transaction that seemed out of place. A person who had been close to the mastermind, someone who had been part of his inner circle, had begun to talk. At first, it was only a whisper, but it quickly turned into a full confession. This individual had been hiding in plain sight, working under a new identity, and had seen the mastermind just a few weeks before. This was the break that law enforcement had been waiting for. The authorities knew that the mastermind wouldn't stay hidden forever. With each day that passed, he became more desperate, and his need to resurface, to make contact with his remaining associates, would eventually give him away. It was just a matter of time. The new lead pointed to a series of transactions tied to a private bank account, one that had been set up using forged documents and false identities. It was an account that had seen significant deposits in recent weeks. The authorities quickly traced the account to a location in Europe, and after further investigation, they found out that the mastermind had been using this account to fund his escape plans. The hunt was on. With this new information, the authorities were able to track him down to a quiet village in the Swiss Alps, where he had been living under a false name. The location, isolated and remote, was the perfect place for someone trying to evade capture. It was a place where the world's most powerful people sometimes went to disappear, and the mastermind had made use of every connection to ensure that his new life was as far removed from the past as possible. When law enforcement arrived at the small villa, they found it abandoned. It was clear that the mastermind had gotten word of the investigation and had made his escape again. The authorities searched the villa for clues, but it was as if he had vanished once more. A few items remained behind: personal belongings, some documents, and even a few handwritten notes, but it was all just more evidence of his meticulous planning. The mastermind had managed to stay one step ahead for years, and even now, when the authorities thought they were close, he had slipped through their grasp again. They couldn't afford to give up now, not after all the years of effort and investigation. But there was a growing sense of doubt among the team. Had they really lost him forever? The mastermind had made his living by controlling information, by creating an illusion so perfect that no one could see through it. But this time, the walls were closing in. The media frenzy continued, and the authorities were not about to let this case go cold. The hunt for the mastermind was still very much alive, and as they sifted through the final pieces of evidence, they began to get closer. The longer he stayed hidden, though, the more people started to wonder if he would ever be brought to justice. The victims, the ones who had lost everything, were starting to lose hope. They had waited for so long for the truth to be revealed, for the mastermind to be caught, but every time they thought they were close, he had managed to slip away. It was as if the man had become a phantom, a shadow that would never be fully captured. But despite the setbacks, the investigation was not over. The mastermind was out there, somewhere, and they wouldn't stop until they had him. The pursuit of the mastermind continued, but with each failed lead, the sense of urgency grew. As months passed, the once celebrated mastermind became a shadow of a man, a fugitive from justice. The world that had once hailed him as a financial genius now watched with bated breath as authorities closed in on his final hiding place. Every time the net seemed to tighten, he slipped away, an expert in evasion, an artist at disappearing. The victims, still reeling from the enormity of the scam, found themselves trapped in an endless cycle of waiting and hoping. As time dragged on, the realization began to settle in. The mastermind had outsmarted them all, or so it seemed. Every move made by law enforcement was met with silence. every investigation leading to a dead end. The mastermind, it seemed, had disappeared from the face of the earth. But then, something unexpected happened. A new tip came in, a tip that would set the investigation on a completely new trajectory. This time, it was a former associate of the masterminds who had finally come forward, someone who had worked closely with him during the early days of the scam. Their conscience had finally caught up with them, and they were ready to spill everything they knew. This tip turned out to be the breakthrough that had been desperately needed. The informant revealed that the mastermind had not just planned his escape, he had been preparing for it for years. He had built an entire network of fake identities, offshore accounts, and safe houses scattered across several countries. His entire life had been an elaborate ruse, one that allowed him to manipulate, deceive, and escape with ease whenever the authorities got too close. The mastermind's ability to blend in with high society, to create an aura of trustworthiness, had been his greatest weapon. But his greatest mistake had been thinking he could escape his own creation. It was this overconfidence, this belief that he could outrun his crimes forever, that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The informant's testimony detailed the mastermind's escape plans in startling detail. He had been preparing for this day ever since the scam had begun to unravel. His money was hidden in numerous international accounts, each one carefully designed to make it impossible to trace. And his final destination? An isolated estate in a remote part of the world, far from the watchful eyes of the media, law enforcement, and the victims who sought justice. As the authorities began to act on this new information, the wheels of justice slowly turned. But even with this crucial new lead, the mastermind remained elusive. His estate, hidden deep in the mountains, was well protected, and the authorities knew it would take more than just a search operation to catch him. For the first time in months, the investigation felt like it was back on track. But this time, there would be no slipping away. The mastermind had made one fatal mistake. He had underestimated the people he had deceived, and they were not going to let him escape without a fight. The search for the mastermind's estate began with a renewed sense of urgency. Law enforcement mobilized their teams, utilizing every resource at their disposal. But as they neared the location, the mastermind's network of accomplices sprang into action. The estate was heavily guarded, and the mastermind had been smart enough to anticipate the authorities' every move. The authorities faced resistance from every angle. At every turn, they encountered false trails, decoy homes, and layers of protection designed to keep them away from the truth. But slowly, with the help of the informant's detailed knowledge of the mastermind's plans, they began to close in. It was a painstaking process, requiring patience, careful strategy, and above all, the belief that they could catch him before he vanished again. The group of investigators, led by the diligent team that had been chasing the mastermind for months, finally located the estate. It was a sprawling compound nestled deep within the mountains, with high walls, security cameras, and a heavily armed perimeter. The mastermind had taken no chances. He had planned every detail, anticipating that this day would come, and had made provisions to ensure his escape would be as seamless as his rise to power. But this time, he had nowhere to run. As the investigators moved in, the tension was palpable. The estate was eerily quiet, as if it were waiting for something or someone. The search team moved cautiously, aware that this could be their last chance to catch the mastermind. Every moment felt like it could be the one when the final curtain was pulled back. And then they found it, a hidden door, concealed behind an elaborate wall of ivy, leading to a tunnel beneath the estate. It was a perfect escape route, one that the mastermind had no doubt intended to use if the authorities ever got too close. The tunnel was long and winding, leading deep into the mountain, with no visible exit in sight. The investigators hesitated at the entrance, knowing this was the final stretch. They had the mastermind cornered, but they couldn't afford to be hasty. One wrong move, and he could slip away once more. After a brief discussion, they made their decision. They would proceed cautiously, following the tunnel's winding path until they reached the heart of the mastermind's hideaway. It was a race against time, and the stakes had never been higher. As they made their way deeper into the tunnel, the silence was broken only by the sound of their footsteps. There was no turning back now. They had come too far, and the mastermind's fate was within their grasp. And then, just as they reached the end of the tunnel, they found it, a small, secluded room, the mastermind sitting calmly inside, as if he had known they would find him all along. There was no struggle, no escape. The mastermind, caught at last, finally looked up, meeting the investigator's gaze. "You've done well," he said quietly, his tone surprisingly calm. But it was always going to end this way. The authorities, who had spent so long chasing shadows, finally had their man. The mastermind, who had once held the world in his hands, was now nothing more than a prisoner of his own making. The mastermind sat in the dimly lit room, his posture relaxed, as if he'd been expecting this moment for some time. The investigators stood around him, their hearts racing with a mix of triumph and disbelief. After months of relentless pursuit, years of carefully orchestrated lies and deception, they had finally caught him. The walls had closed in, and there would be no more running, no more fake identities or hidden estates. Yet, there was something strange about the way the mastermind regarded the situation. He wasn't panicked, nor was he angry. There was a quiet acceptance in his eyes, as though he had known that this day would come, as if he'd been waiting for it all along. "You're probably wondering how I managed to stay hidden for so long," he said, breaking the silence with a calmness that seemed almost unnerving. "But I suppose that's the trick, isn't it? To build something so perfect, so flawless, that even the people chasing you can't quite figure out what's missing." The investigators exchanged glances. There was no doubt in their minds that this man was brilliant, manipulative, yes, but brilliant. He had built a billion-dollar empire from lies, and somehow, he had done it with such precision that it had taken law enforcement years to uncover the full scope of his operation. "Why did you do it?" one of the investigators finally asked, his voice steady but filled with the weight of years spent chasing this elusive figure. What was the point of all of this? Was it just for money? For power? The mastermind smiled slightly, a faint, almost sad expression. "Money is just a means to an end. It's never about the money. It's about control. It's about making people believe in something, believing in me, when there's nothing there. It's about knowing that you can make people do anything if you promise them what they want." His words hung in the air, chilling in their simplicity. This wasn't just a man who had orchestrated a scam. This was a man who had manipulated the very fabric of trust. He hadn't just taken money, he had taken lives, futures, and faith. He had turned dreams into nightmares for thousands of people, all for the thrill of control. "But why the lie?" another investigator asked, his voice laced with frustration. "You could have built something legitimate, something real. You had the power, the resources, the skills. Why destroy so many lives?" The mastermind leaned back in his chair, his gaze unfocused for a moment, as if recalling the past. Building something real was never the goal. People want certainty. They want to believe in things, ideas, investments, promises. It's easy to manipulate that. They want to believe in a story, so I gave them one. But at the end of the day, I was always the storyteller, the one in control of the narrative. If you can control the story, you control everything." There was a brief silence as the investigators absorbed his words. The mastermind wasn't just a fraudster. He was a master of psychological manipulation. He had not only deceived people with fabricated financial promises, but he had made them believe they were part of something bigger than themselves. They had invested not just their money, but their trust, their hopes, and their futures into him. And he had used that trust to his advantage. "Do you regret it?" one of the investigators asked, his voice almost sympathetic. The mastermind paused before answering, his eyes meeting theirs with an unreadable expression. "Regret? I regret nothing. Everything I did because I could, because I had the power to control the narrative, to shape the story. If I'd built something legitimate, I would have been limited. But this was limitless." The words left the investigators speechless. It was clear now that the mastermind wasn't just a man who had taken advantage of a system. He was someone who had thrived on deception, someone who had reveled in the game itself. The power to deceive, to manipulate, to pull the strings and watch as people fell into his carefully constructed world. But now, that world was falling apart. The mastermind had spent years building an empire on lies, but in the end, it wasn't the money that mattered, it was the power, the control. And that control was slipping away from him. As the investigation continued, the authorities uncovered more about the mastermind's network of accomplices. People who had helped him execute his plan, people who had aided him in making the scam look legitimate. Many of them were just as invested in maintaining the illusion as the mastermind himself. But as the details came to light, it became clear that some of them were just pawns, manipulated by the mastermind's charm and cunning. Others, however, were just as guilty, complicit in the scheme to the very end. It wasn't just the mastermind who was going down, it was his entire operation. The money trail led to secret accounts and hidden assets, but it also led to more people who had been deceived and betrayed by him. The victims of the scam were many, and their stories were only just beginning to be told. The mastermind's fall from grace was swift. Once the full scope of his fraud was revealed, the world watched as his empire crumbled. Investors who had trusted him were left to pick up the pieces, fighting for justice, fighting for restitution. It wasn't just about the financial losses, it was about the loss of trust, the loss of faith in a system that had allowed someone like him to thrive. In the end, the mastermind was charged with multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. His assets were seized, his company dismantled, and his name forever tarnished. His legacy was no longer one of success. It was a cautionary tale, a reminder of how far someone could go when they played on the vulnerabilities of those around them. But as his trial unfolded and the pieces of his operation were pieced together, the mastermind remained silent. He had been the storyteller, the one who had woven the narrative of success, but now he was just another figure in a courtroom, facing the consequences of his actions. He had controlled the story for so long, but now the world would write the ending. The last chapter of his tale was not one of triumph. It was a story of a man who had built a house of cards, only to watch it crumble when the truth came out. As the trial against the mastermind began, the weight of his actions truly began to sink in. The courtroom was filled with the victims, those whose lives had been ruined by his lies, and their voices rang out, sharing the stories of their personal losses. Some had lost their life savings. Others had been duped into believing they were part of an elite financial operation, only to realize that they had been pawns in a game they didn't even know they were playing. Each testimony was a harsh reminder of the devastation he had caused. As they took the stand, many victims spoke of their trust in the man, how they had invested not just money but their futures, their dreams. He had painted them a picture of a prosperous future, a future where they were not just investors, but partners in something monumental. And for many of them, that dream had been shattered in an instant. But what struck the court most was the sheer scale of his deception. It wasn't just about stealing from people. It was about controlling them, convincing them that the lies were the truth, that they were part of something important. He had used their own trust to manipulate them into investing more and more, to keep pushing them deeper into his web. As the testimonies continued, it became clear just how expertly the mastermind had pulled off his scam. He had known exactly what to say to get people on board, how to make them feel like they were part of something exclusive, something that couldn't fail. And when the doubts started to creep in, he knew exactly how to allay those fears, how to make everything seem like it was going according to plan. He had created an illusion of success that was so perfect, so convincing, that no one could see through it until it was too late. But even as the victims shared their stories, one question still lingered. How had he managed to stay hidden for so long? How had he built such a perfect network of lies and kept it intact, even as the money disappeared? As the trial progressed, the authorities began to piece together the final parts of the puzzle. They uncovered new evidence, hidden accounts, encrypted communications, and secret meetings that revealed just how elaborate the mastermind's operation had been. He had built a world within a world, a network of trust and deceit that stretched across continents, one that allowed him to evade capture for so long. But it was his connections that were his greatest weapon. As the investigation deepened, more names were revealed, high-profile figures, business partners, and even government officials who had been complicit, knowingly or unknowingly, in the operation. These connections had allowed the mastermind to slip through the cracks, to stay one step ahead of the authorities and the growing suspicions. But as the walls began to close in, his supporters began to turn. Some who had once been loyal to him began to realize the extent of the fraud, and as their own reputations were put at risk, they turned against him. One by one, they began to testify against him, offering up crucial information that helped paint a complete picture of his operation. The mastermind, once so confident and in control, now found himself isolated. His empire had crumbled, and the support that had once shielded him was gone. His carefully constructed world of luxury and power had fallen apart, and he was left with nothing but the cold reality of the consequences he now faced. As the final witnesses took the stand, it became clear that the mastermind's fate was sealed. The evidence was overwhelming. The victims' stories were heart-wrenching, and the truth could no longer be denied. The mastermind's reign of deception had come to an end. And yet, as the verdict was read, the mastermind remained eerily calm. He was convicted on all charges: fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. But despite the weight of his conviction, it was clear that the man who had once seemed invincible had finally been brought to justice. However, the damage had already been done. For the victims, the trial and the conviction were a form of closure, but it could never replace the years of hard work, the dreams that had been dashed, and the trust that had been shattered. The mastermind's name would forever be associated with the biggest financial scam in history, a cautionary tale for anyone who thought they could outwit the system and get away with it. As the courtroom cleared, the victims and their families found themselves left to rebuild. Some found solace in knowing that the mastermind would face the consequences of his actions, while others found that no amount of justice could restore what had been taken from them. They had learned the hard way that no matter how smooth someone seems, no one is above suspicion. The media coverage surrounding the case slowly died down, but the echoes of the scam lingered. People continued to question how it had happened, how they had all been so easily deceived. The scandal served as a harsh reminder of how fragile trust could be, how easy it was for someone to manipulate others when they were given just the right amount of power and influence. For the mastermind, the trial marked the end of an era. His empire, built on lies, had crumbled around him. He was no longer the charming, persuasive figure he once was. He was just another convicted criminal, facing the consequences of his actions. But even in his final moments of defeat, there was a strange sense of inevitability. He had played the game to the fullest, had pushed the limits of deception and manipulation. And in the end, it was his own arrogance, his belief that he could outsmart everyone forever, that led to his downfall. The truth, it seemed, had finally caught up with him. The mastermind's conviction marked the beginning of a long and painful chapter for his victims. For years, they had been living with the uncertainty of whether the truth would ever come to light, whether justice would be served. Now that it had, they found themselves facing a new reality, one where they had to rebuild not just their finances, but their trust in the system that had failed them so completely. For many, the trial's conclusion was bittersweet. The mastermind had been brought to justice, but the damage was irreversible. The scam had affected thousands of people, and for some, the financial losses were staggering. People who had invested their life savings, their retirement funds, or even their children's education money found themselves penniless. And while the conviction was a victory, it felt hollow to those who would never see the returns they had been promised. As the dust settled, some victims chose to speak publicly about their experiences, sharing their stories in the hopes of preventing others from falling prey to similar scams. Others, however, preferred to move on quietly, trying to piece together their lives in the aftermath of the devastation. But one thing was clear: the scam had changed them. It had altered the way they viewed the financial world, the people they trusted, and even themselves. The mastermind, meanwhile, found himself in a much different world. He had once been at the top of his game, the face of a thriving enterprise. Now he was behind bars, stripped of his wealth, his influence, and his freedom. The luxurious life he had once led, private jets, expensive suits, and exclusive vacation homes, was now a distant memory. He was no longer the charismatic leader who had charmed his way to the top. He was just another inmate in a cold, unforgiving prison. The truth about his scam had spread far and wide, and his name had become synonymous with betrayal and deceit. But even as he sat in his cell, isolated from the world he had once ruled, he remained eerily calm. He had always believed that he could control everything, that he could manipulate the narrative to his advantage. And while his escape from justice had been delayed, he knew that there was still a chance, however slim, that he could regain some of his influence. His downfall, however, wasn't just about the financial crime. It was about how completely he had woven his web of lies. It wasn't enough for him to simply steal money. He had to control the hearts and minds of everyone around him. He had to make them believe that they were part of something bigger, something more important than just an investment. He had to make them feel like they were contributing to a grand vision, something that would change the world. But in the end, it was this very arrogance that led to his undoing. He had become too complacent, too confident in his ability to deceive. He had underestimated the power of those he had wronged, the strength of those who had been betrayed. And in the end, it was this strength that caught up with him. As the mastermind sat in his prison cell, his future uncertain, his mind began to turn over the events that had led him here. He had been brilliant, yes, but he had also been reckless. The people he had manipulated were not as weak or as gullible as he had thought. And the law, while slow to catch up, had eventually found a way to expose the truth. For the victims, the fight wasn't over. Many still faced the long, difficult road to recovery. Some filed lawsuits to reclaim their lost investments, hoping that the mastermind's assets would be seized and distributed to those he had stolen from. But the legal battles were often drawn out, and the chances of fully recovering their losses were slim. Still, the victims fought on, determined to hold the mastermind accountable for his actions. As the years passed, the mastermind's name became a cautionary tale. His scam was studied in business schools, examined by financial experts, and dissected by those who wanted to understand how such a massive fraud could have been perpetrated so successfully. He became a symbol of what could happen when greed, manipulation, and charisma were allowed to run unchecked. But for those who had been affected by the scam, the story wasn't one of learning or growth. It was one of loss, regret, and the painful process of moving forward. They had trusted someone who had sold them a dream that turned out to be nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion. And while the mastermind may have spent the rest of his life behind bars, for the victims, the real question remained: how could they ever trust again? How could they rebuild their faith in a system that had allowed such a massive fraud to take place in the first place? The story of the $1 billion scam would be remembered as one of the most audacious financial crimes in history. But for those who had lived through it, it would always be a reminder of how easily trust could be shattered and how long it took to rebuild what had been broken. As the years passed, the aftermath of the $1 billion scam continued to echo throughout the financial world, its impact still rippling through the lives of the victims. Many of those who had been deceived struggled to find closure, still haunted by the thought of how easily they had been manipulated. Trust, once the foundation of their lives, had been shattered, and it was not something they could simply rebuild overnight. The damage was deep, more than just financial. It was emotional, psychological, and social. For some, the legal battles dragged on for years. The mastermind's assets had been seized, but they weren't nearly enough to compensate for the colossal losses. Court cases piled up, with lawyers and victims fighting for what little could be salvaged. It was a slow process, one that drained the emotional energy of everyone involved. Some victims eventually gave up on the courts, realizing that even if they won, there would never be a way to restore the years they had lost. The loss of trust in the system, both in the financial world and in the justice system itself, was perhaps the greatest wound left by the scam. But there were also those who refused to give up. They refused to let the mastermind be the last word in their story. Some formed support groups, turning their collective grief into action. They shared resources, offered emotional support, and found strength in each other. In many ways, these groups became a form of resistance, a way for the victims to reclaim something of their lives. They no longer saw themselves as just victims of a crime. They were fighters, determined to ensure that their story didn't end in defeat. Over time, the scam faded from the public eye, replaced by newer financial crises, new scandals, and fresh stories of deception. But for the victims, it was a constant shadow. The news cycle moved on, but they remained stuck in the past, unable to move forward until they had reconciled with what had happened. As for the mastermind, his life in prison was anything but glamorous. The man who had once held the world in his hands now found himself isolated, alone, and forced to confront the reality of his actions. The trials, the media attention, the courtrooms. It was all a far cry from the life of luxury and power he had once known. His world, built on lies, had crumbled around him, leaving him with nothing. The man who had manipulated so many now had to rely on others for his survival in prison. His carefully crafted image as a powerful, influential figure was gone, replaced by the cold reality of his situation. Inside the walls of his prison cell, the mastermind had plenty of time to reflect on the choices that had led him here. He spent his days in isolation, cut off from the world he had once controlled. The outside world had long since moved on, but inside the prison, he was a constant reminder of the consequences of unchecked greed and manipulation. Some prisoners whispered about him, others mocked him. He had once been a man of great influence, but now he was just another inmate, a figure to be forgotten in the maze of prison life. But even in this isolation, the mastermind's mind never stopped working. It was said that he had a way with words, even behind bars. He began to work on a book, a memoir of sorts, telling his version of the story. But his writing wasn't about redemption, it was about control. He still wanted to shape the narrative, even from prison. He wanted people to see him as a victim of the system, as a man who had been misunderstood, not a criminal mastermind. His attempts at writing were a desperate attempt to reclaim the power he had lost, to rewrite his story in a way that would put him back in control. Outside the prison walls, the victims continued their lives, but the echoes of the scam never fully left them. Some tried to return to normalcy, starting over in new careers, new homes, and new relationships. Others found themselves still trapped in the past, unable to escape the shadow of the scam. For them, the road to recovery was long and often painful. But the story wasn't over. The financial world had learned a harsh lesson from the $1 billion scam. The cracks in the system that had allowed the mastermind to pull off such an audacious scheme were beginning to show, and there was a growing movement within the industry to create more oversight, more transparency, and more safeguards to protect investors. But as with most things in finance, these efforts were slow and often hampered by bureaucratic red tape. In the end, the $1 billion scam served as a warning to anyone who was tempted by the allure of easy wealth. The mastermind's success had been built on a lie, a carefully constructed illusion of success that had captivated everyone around him. It wasn't just the money that had been stolen. It was the trust, the faith, and the belief that there were no limits to ambition. The mastermind had shown that even the most solid foundations could be cracked, that nothing was truly secure when deceit and manipulation were allowed to run unchecked. And so, as the years passed, the scam became a chapter in the history of financial fraud, one of the largest, most intricate scams in modern history. The mastermind's name became a symbol of deception, a reminder of the dangers of placing too much trust in someone who promises the world but offers nothing but empty words. But for the victims, the story was more personal. It wasn't just about numbers and financial statements. It was about lives, families, and futures that had been ruined by a man who had played with their hopes and dreams. The scam had left scars, some visible, others hidden deep within. And as they moved forward, they carried those scars with them, a reminder of the price they had paid for believing in the dream of easy wealth. The mastermind, isolated in his prison, had nothing left to offer. But the victims, though forever changed, had begun to rebuild. They had learned the hard way that trust, once broken, is not easily mended. But they also learned that even in the face of betrayal, there is hope, and there is always the possibility of starting over. The scam was over. The mastermind was behind bars. But for those affected, the journey of healing had only just begun. Time, as it always does, continued its relentless march forward. For the mastermind, locked behind bars, the world outside moved on. Yet, within the cold, sterile walls of the prison, his mind never rested. The loss of his power, the abruptness of his fall from grace, was a constant reminder of what he had once been and what he had become. Despite his circumstances, a small part of him still believed that he could regain what he had lost. He had, after all, built an empire once. How difficult could it be to do it again, from the shadows? In the meantime, the victims, once victims of a grand scheme, began to shift their perspectives. The world around them had not stopped for them, nor had their lives been paused indefinitely. Some found themselves rebuilding faster than they had anticipated. New investments, new ventures, new relationships started to form. For some, it was like a slow rebirth, a chance to begin again, wiser and more cautious, but with a renewed sense of hope. Others struggled to rebuild, burdened by the emotional scars left behind by the scam. The financial world, too, began to change. The scam had rocked the foundations of trust in a way few things could. Laws were rewritten. New regulations and safeguards were put in place to prevent something like this from ever happening again. Or so it seemed. The damage done was profound, but the lesson was clear. Trust, once broken, takes more than time to mend. It takes transparency, accountability, and real change within the systems that had enabled the scam to continue unchecked for so long. In the years that followed, the story of the $1 billion scam faded from the public's immediate memory. The world moved on to the next scandal, the next corporate failure, the next crisis. But for the victims, the echoes of what had happened remained. The people who had trusted, who had believed, who had risked it all, were still left piecing their lives back together. The mastermind, however, remained as he had always been, calm, calculated, and persistent. Despite being locked away in prison, he still had connections, still had the ability to influence things from the shadows. The money he had stolen had been laundered, hidden across borders in various forms, and his ability to manipulate had not vanished completely. There were rumors that, even from behind bars, he was trying to orchestrate new schemes, reach out to former associates, and lay the groundwork for another escape. The authorities, having investigated his networks for years, knew this. They understood that his manipulation didn't stop just because he was behind bars. They couldn't risk complacency, knowing that the mastermind had never played by the rules. But they also understood that, as time went on, his influence would only wane, and he would have fewer ways to get what he wanted. The walls of his prison, both literal and metaphorical, were slowly closing in on him. Still, as much as the mastermind had lost, there was something almost tragic about him. He had always believed that he could control everything, that he could manipulate people and situations with perfect precision. But in the end, his hubris had been his downfall. His refusal to accept the consequences of his actions, his desperate need to maintain control, led him to a place where his empire, his name, and his legacy were forever tarnished. He had been the architect of his own destruction, and now, in the cold isolation of his cell, he had nothing left but his thoughts. For the victims, the memories of the scam would never truly fade. They would always remember the day they first learned the truth, the day their lives were forever altered. But with time, they had begun to heal. They had learned not to let their past define them. They were no longer just victims of a scam. They were survivors, warriors in their own right, who had fought to reclaim their lives, their futures, and their trust. The mastermind's downfall had marked the end of one chapter, but for the victims, it was the beginning of something new. They had lost a great deal, yes, but they had also gained something invaluable: the knowledge that they could rebuild, that they could overcome. The trust that had been shattered would never be fully restored, but they had found a way to move forward, to rise from the ashes of their former selves. And so, as the world turned its attention to new stories, new scandals, new financial crises, the victims of the $1 billion scam continued on. They lived their lives day by day, knowing that the scars of the past would always remain, but that they were stronger for having survived it. The scam had been a devastating chapter in their lives, but it was no longer the defining story. As for the mastermind, his fate had been sealed. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, forgotten by the world, a cautionary tale for those who thought they could manipulate and deceive without consequence. His empire was gone, his legacy tarnished. But in the dark corners of his mind, he would always be the puppet master, the one who had controlled it all, if only for a fleeting moment. The story was over. The scam had been exposed. The mastermind was captured. The victims had survived. But the lesson, the one that the mastermind had never learned, remained. Trust is fragile, and once broken, it's not easily repaired. And in the end, it was trust that had been the real casualty of this entire scheme.